Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. At the beginning of Meditation 6, Rene Descartes is going to draw a vital distinction between two different faculties of the human mind, both of which we hopefully use quite often, although perhaps some people only rely on one of them, which can get them into trouble. And those are the lower faculty of imagination and the higher faculty of what he calls here pure intellection or conception. Now, this actually corresponds to what in other places he's been calling the intellect or understanding, the entendement. There's going to be a vital difference between these that we're going to see emerge in this. Before we go into that, we should think a little bit about what he means by this. So, the imagination is this faculty by which we picture things, or we engage in, either spontaneously or deliberately putting things together in such a way that we can frame them in our minds. And we do so not necessarily just through visual images, but we might imagine sounds or odors or tactile sensations. For example, if I tell you right now to imagine a pink elephant, you're able to do that, I imagine. And now imagine that you're going up to the elephant and touching its side, and you feel its skin, and surprisingly it's so soft. Its hairs are soft, its skin is soft and kind of giving in. Well, then you've done some visualization, but not just visualization. You've also done, we might call it tactilization as well. That's imagination, right? Intellection is going to be something a bit different. And so Descartes is going to tell us early on that if I consider closely what imagination is, I find that it's nothing other than a certain application of the faculty that knows to bodies that are intimately present to it, and therefore that they exist. This is where we're going with this. That's the upshot of that. But first he says we really need to think about what the difference between imagination and pure intellection and conception is. So, he says, let's do geometry here. Imagine a triangle. Not hard to do, right? You just kind of draw three lines in your head, or maybe you just popped it into your head right now. So that's one way of grasping what a triangle is. As a matter of fact, we could put one right here on the board, right? Here's a nice little triangle. In case you're having trouble imagining it, you can just look at that one right there. So he says, when I imagine a triangle, I don't conceive only a figure composed and comprised of three lines, but beyond that, I consider these three lines like as if they're present by the force and inner application of my mind. I think of them. I place them here in my mind. And he says that's properly what I call imagining. But when I want to think of, and here he brings up a term that you're probably not familiar with, a kilogon, right? What is a kilogon? Well, it comes from the Greek word for thousand, right? A thousand-sided figure. Try to imagine that now. Try to bring before your mind a figure that has 1,000 sides. Do you know if it has 1,000 sides? Did you just put together in your mind something that has a whole bunch of sides and it's almost like a circle, and maybe it's actually like a 100-sided figure. Maybe it's a 1,001-sided figure, unless you can actually count them in your head, which is very, very tough to visualize. you're not sure that you actually have a kilogon there. He says, when I want to think of a kilogon, I can easily conceive of the truth that it's a figure composed of 1,000 sides, as easily as I conceive of a triangle is a figure composed of 3 sides. But when I try to imagine the 1,000 sides of a kilogon like I do with the 3 of a triangle, to think of them as present with the eyes of the mind, what happens? He says, following the custom that I have to use my imagination all the time when I think of corporeal things, it happens that in conceiving of a kilogon, I represent within my mind, he says, a figure that is confusedly representing this, right? Confusedly is a problem. Why? Because that's the opposite of distinctly. I need to have clear and distinct ideas for Descartes, right? But I don't have a clear and distinct idea of a kilogon in the sense that I imagine it. I can't have a clear and distinct idea when I'm going away from the senses, going away from diagrams, and just conceiving of it, thinking about its properties when I'm using this higher part of my mind, and going away from trying to picture it. So he says that it's very evident that this figure is not a kilogon, since it doesn't differ at all from what I would represent if I think of a myriagon or some other figure with many sides. So this doesn't help me to discern what the properties are of the kilogon. What about if I think of a pentagon? Well, that's a little bit easier, right? Can you imagine a pentagon? Sure. Picture one of those things on the soccer ball. There's hexagons and pentagons on soccer balls. Or just think of a pentagon. Think of the place where we have the U.S. military command and all that other sort of bureaucracy surrounding them. Or any other 5-sided figure you like. Make it square and add 2 more lines, right? Substituting for the 1 line. Not hard to do. Now conceive of the pentagon and think about how many degrees it has to have. Do you remember that equation from back in algebra or geometry when you were studying many-sided figures? Triangle has 180, square has 360, and you can go on from there. Well, that you're using your intellect. You're not actually using your imagination. And so he says that when we consider a pentagon, we can easily, do it with the imagination, but we can also conceive of it without the aid of the imagination. I can imagine it, he says. I can bring it to the attention of my mind, each of these 5 sides and the space that they contain. And then I can conceive clearly that I don't actually have any need of the imagination in order to do this. As a matter of fact, the imagination, in some respect, requires a little bit more effort. He talks about a particular contention, and it's that in the French and in the Latin, needed to imagine the pentagon. And this, he says, shows us one of the key differences between imagination and intellection. So here's what it consists in. Very interesting idea. The imagination, he says, is not actually necessary or essential for the human mind. Now, all of us do have an imagination, and you might say, well, if it's not essential, then why do we have it? It's not essential for us to know the properties of geometric objects. As a matter of fact, sometimes it can get in the way, like it does with the kilogon. So it's an add-on. It's a surplus. He says it depends, this shows us, it depends on something other than, something distinct from my mind. What is that something? He's actually going to say it's bodies There is another possibility. Maybe it's ideas in God's mind or something like that. But he gets rid of that idea. No, it's the external world and the body through which we encounter that external world. That's the add-on. It's not essential to our mind. Imagination, if it's essential at all, it's essential to the composite of mind and body. Takes in information coming from the senses and from the storehouse of memory and works with those things and allows us to picture or imagine things. Intellection, however, is, he says, necessary and essential to my mind. It's absolutely essential. It's what we've been doing throughout the entire course of the meditations. Think about how we began. We engaged in this hyperbolic doubt. We put aside anything that might arrive through our senses or our imagination or our memory, and we made recourse to thinking about the nature of the mind itself. The mind, he says, conceives itself by turning towards itself. It doesn't do it through imagination. When it uses the imagination to try to picture itself, it screws things up. This is why we need to separate intellection from imagination and the senses. What it does is it considers its own ideas. Now, he goes on a little bit further, and he says that I conceive easily that the imagination can be of this sort if it is true that the body, or body in general, exists. That there is body, quite literally in the French. Il y aurait, right? Sort of the conditional of the il y a, there is, something exists. So this is going to allow him to say that we actually do have an external world and a body. We're going to get there eventually. There is one other thing that's worth pointing out, and this comes later in the discussion of the faculties. He says that I find inside myself faculties of thinking that are quite particular and distinct from me. That is, the faculties of imagining and sensing, without which I could, in fact, conceive clearly and distinctly myself entirely. But not only can I think of myself, not only can they be thought different than me, right? But they can't be thought without a substance intelligent that they are attached to. So something like a mind. How are they attached to the mind? This is where we get to the mind-body connection. And he says that the notion that we have of these faculties, or to use the terms of the school, in their concept, their formal concept, they include a certain kind of intellection from which I conceive that they are distinct from me, like figures, movements, and other modes or accidents of bodies are from the body themselves which sustain them. So we have a really interesting realization here. I have an imagination. You have an imagination. All of us have imaginations. But our imaginations are separable from us. They're not really what we are, insofar as we're thinking substances. They're add-ons, they're extras, they're surpluses. And they are precisely that because we are, in fact, minds joined in some way that Descartes doesn't explain here to the body. We have the imagination only because we have bodies and thereby can start to picture and imagine and make use of the senses to understand things. So we have to be very careful to distinguish these apart from each other, because when we're thinking about the nature of the mind itself, we don't want to try to imagine it. We want to do what Descartes has been doing, and that is to understand the mind through conception or intellection, the use of the faculty of understanding rather than the faculty of imagination.